Today we're going to be sewing my latest pattern release, which is the Amelia top or dress. I absolutely love this pattern. It's perfect for summer. Once you've printed and assembled your pattern, we can go ahead and cut out our fabric. So for the Amelia pattern, we're going to cut out 2 of our main pattern pieces, and we're also going to cut the exact same pattern, but we're going to use this as our lining. We're going to also cut that out 2 times. So total, we have 4 layers of fabric. I recently picked up these fabric shears. I just bought them online. I'll have it linked below, but these are really helpful whenever you're cutting out multiple layers of fabric. So as you can see, it's cutting through all of those 4 layers super easily. I just like to make sure I'm very careful anytime that I use this. I'm going to let the audio play while I'm using these fabric shears just so you can hear how loud it is. These fabric shears are not 100% necessary, but they do come in handy, especially when you're cutting out through multiple layers of fabric. There are actually many versions of these fabric shears, but I'll have the ones that I got linked in the description box below. Now that we have all of our fabric pieces cut out, I'm just going to use this fabric marking chalk to mark an X on the wrong side of the fabric. I'm going to mark an X on the wrong sides of the main fabric pieces, and I'm also going to mark an X on the wrong sides of the lining fabric pieces as well. This step is especially important if you're using fabric that looks very similar on the right side and the wrong side. With right sides facing, I'm going to pin my main fabric pieces with right sides together, and I'm also going to repeat that same exact step for the lining fabric as well. Now you just want to take your pieces to your sewing machine, and you're going to sew along that clipped seam with 1/2 of an inch seam allowance, making sure to backstitch at the beginning and the end of your seam. Once you finish sewing both of those seams, you just want to trim that seam allowance down to about 1/8 of an inch. Now we're going to place our main fabric piece to our lining piece with right sides facing, and we're going to pin starting at that shoulder seam and along the neckline. I've been really loving using these Wonder clips. They're just basically like little binder clips or fabric clips that help to keep your fabric in place. I'll have these linked in the description box as well, but you can use sewing pins or these Wonder clips, whichever you prefer. Once you finish pinning or clipping along that neckline, go ahead and take your fabric to your sewing machine, and you just want to sew along that clipped edge with 1/2 of an inch seam allowance, making sure to backstitch at the beginning and the end of your seams. Once you finish sewing your seam, you can go ahead and trim that seam allowance down to about 1/8 of an inch. If you've been sewing for any amount of time, you might have already caught on to the fact that a lot of sewing is actually ironing and pressing your fabric as well. So whenever you're done sewing your seam, take your fabric to your iron, and we're just going to use our iron just to kind of roll that seam line down towards the lining of the fabric. So you'll see that seam line. I want you to kind of press that a little bit more towards the lining piece. Use your iron to help you press that in place. This is going to help give you a neater finish at the end of your project. So you won't see that seam line from the right side of your fabric. It'll be rolled in towards the lining. Now this next step can look a little bit confusing, but I promise once you do it a few times, it's not as tricky as it looks. And if you guys have any questions about any of the steps in this video tutorial, just leave me a comment and I'll get back to you as fast as I can. With the right side of the fabric facing up, we're gonna pin along that armhole. So I just want you to kind of roll your fabric as you see me doing here. So you're gonna take one of those seam lines and you're gonna kind of wrap it around that rolled burrito and you're gonna clip that in place. So we're just pinning along that armhole seam. So just go ahead and kind of maneuver your fabric around and you're just going to clip along that armhole seam, making sure that you're only working along that armhole. Since the fabric is so close together, you might clip some of the excess fabric, but we're only working along that armhole seam, again with the right sides facing. Once you have that arm side clipped, you just want to take your fabric to your sewing machine and you're going to sew with 1/2 inch seam allowance. But you want to be very careful as you sew, making sure that you're only sewing that armhole in place. Once you finish sewing that seam, you can go ahead and trim that down to about 1/8 inch. Go ahead and press your seam at your iron, and then I want you to turn that entire dress with the right sides facing out. So just kind of put your arm inside of the dress and pull that with the right sides facing out. It can be a little bit tricky just to get through that shoulder seam of the dress, but go ahead and just take your time and just turn that dress with the right sides facing out. Now we can get to the funnest part of making this dress, which is that nice shoulder twist along the shoulder. We're going to do 4 complete turns, starting from the center front of the dress out towards that side seam of the dress. So as you can see, I just grabbed that neckline piece and then I'm turning that out towards that armhole side seam. 4 complete turns. So one way all the way around, and then you're going to repeat that 3 more times. This step and the following steps can seem a little bit tricky, so go ahead and just pause and rewind these clips as many times as you need to. Now with the right side of our fabric facing up, we're going to open up those front and back pieces and we're going to pin along the side seams. So go ahead and just open up your fabric pieces again with the right sides of the fabric facing up, and then we're just going to take those side seams and we're going to pin or clip them again with the right sides facing. And we're gonna do the same exact step to both of the side seams. Anytime you're pinning or clipping a seam, it's always best to start at that seam line. I usually will clip at the seam line and then I'll clip at the bottom or the top of the fabric, and then I just evenly clip throughout the entire seam. Most important part of this step is that you want to leave a 2-inch opening along one of the side seams, preferably on the seam that is going to be inside of your fabric. So go ahead and just leave a 2-inch seam along that inner lining piece of the back of your fabric. This 2-inch opening is going to help us sew the hem of the dress in a later step. Once you've finished pinning or clipping both of those side seams in place, you can go ahead and take your fabric to your sewing machine and you're going to sew with 1/2 inch seam allowance, making sure to backstitch at the beginning and the end of your seams. And also don't forget to leave that 2-inch opening so that we can sew the hem of our dress in a later step. Once you finish sewing your side seams, go ahead and trim that seam allowance down to about 1/8 inch. And then I want you to take your dress and turn it with the right sides facing out. So this next step is definitely going to look a little bit awkward as you sew it, but I promise once you sew that seam, it's going to look beautiful on the inside. We're going to grab the seam line along the hem area of the right side of the main fabric, and then we're going to clip that with the right sides facing to the seam line along the hem area of the right side of the lining fabric. And then I just want you to continue clipping the hemline of the main fabric and the hemline of the lining fabric with right sides together. You will have to awkwardly turn the dress into itself in order to clip all along the hemline, just like you see me doing here. Remember, you can pause or rewind any of the clips in this video just to help you get a better idea of what's going on. And also, I suggest using a basting stitch if you're unsure if you've clipped everything correctly. You can use a basting stitch. That way, whenever you turn your fabric with the right sides facing out, if anything was sewn incorrectly, you can just easily use your seam ripper to take out that basting seam. So a basting stitch is just using the longest stitch length on your sewing machine to temporarily hold your fabric in place. Once you've clipped along that entire hemline of your dress, you can just take your fabric to your sewing machine and you're going to sew starting at one of those side seams with 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around, making sure to backstitch at the beginning and the end of your seams. Once you finish sewing your seam, just go ahead and trim that seam allowance down to about 1/8 inch. And then you're going to use that 2-inch opening to turn your dress with the right sides facing out. So go ahead and just take your time with this step and carefully turn your dress with the right sides facing out. And then you just want to use that 2-inch opening, and you're going to turn those seam lines into the wrong side of the fabric. You can either hand stitch this 2-inch opening closed, or you can just take that 2-inch opening to your sewing machine and then you can top stitch that opening shut. Once you finish with that, you are all done with your Amelia pattern. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I had so much fun making this top and this dress. I've already made several versions. You can check out those on my Instagram at Rosie Pena, and then make sure to visit the pattern website, rosiepenapattern.com, where you can find more beautiful sewing patterns and step-by-step video tutorials. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you'll come back to my channel. Make sure you hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Bye guys!